Ah, the 1980s. My absolute favourite decade. The music was great, the movies were awesome, and although the fashion was somewhat questionable, I can't help but look back on it with fond nostalgia. They say that the 80s fashion is making a comeback, you know. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to the Oddest. So, what makes a good UFO case? Let's go through the checklist. Solid evidence? Check. Credible witnesses? Check. Sightings of a craft? Check. In fact, how about two official military personnel standing close enough to sketch and even touch the craft? Check and double check. We've got it all, from eyewitness testimony to audio recordings by high-ranking officials and even an appearance of the Men in Black. So, sit back, get your feet up, and let's look at the Rendlesham UFO incident. The 1980s are famous for so many things. In 1981, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. By that time, the Cold War was still ongoing with the Soviet Union. Reagan had decided that enough was enough. Soviet forces had invaded Afghanistan, which made things worse for the superpowers of the world, and it was time to put an end to it all. Meanwhile, back here in the UK, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was of the same opinion as Reagan, and as such, she basically told him, whatever he needed, whatever we could do to help, it shall be done. The President poured countless dollars into the funding of the armed forces. The idea was to move American forces across to the UK. From there, it would be easier to launch across the English Channel and into Europe. In order to help accomplish this, Reagan ordered a complete phase-out of all F-4 Phantom fighter jets in order to make way for the new and improved fighter, the A-10 Thunderbolt. In a strategic move, the US moved the Tactical Fighter Wing's 3 squadrons across to various airbases in Europe. 2 of these bases were hidden deep in the forests of East Anglia in England. In the county of Suffolk, there were tons of airbases dotted throughout the countryside. These were no longer active, but were key positions during World War II in the fight against the German Luftwaffe. 2 of these airbases now played home to the 78th and 79th Tactical Fighter Squadrons. Half of them were posted at RAF Bentwaters and the other half RAF Woodbridge, around 6 miles to the south. Between the 2 airbases were nothing but forest. 15 square kilometres of woodland known as Rendlesham Forest. So by Christmas of 1980, the American servicemen were settled into their respective bases, all the while keeping their eyes on the prize, keeping focused on their objective and thinking about the Soviet threat. Little did they know that the Soviets wouldn't be their only concern and that they would be forced to deal with something they were not expecting. Something not of this earth. At around 3 AM on the 26th of December, memories of Christmas Day were still fresh in the minds of those on duty, when suddenly the emergency alert system at RAF Bentwaters was activated. I imagine for any military personnel stationed at these bases, it must be terrifying when the emergency alert system activates, because that usually means something is coming. Deafening sirens filled every room and corridor of the base. Anyone that was asleep was now awake and in full response mode. The alert would be heard from miles around, putting not only the military staff on high alert, but also alerting the locals that there was something in the sky. Armed personnel spilled out of doorways. Air Force sentries ran across parade squares and car parks in order to take up defensive firing positions along the base's perimeter. One of these soldiers was Airman Steve Longero. He was on duty at the time and on foot patrol near to the base's weapons lockers when the alarm activated. He took up his designated position along with several colleagues along the fence line. He suddenly became aware of something moving, but it wasn't up in the sky. It was in the thick of the surrounding woodland. So what exactly was Airman Longero looking at? Well, he reported to have seen an unearthly red glow. Several of them in fact, and they were moving through the trees back and forth at great speeds. All witnesses were fixated. The bright lights flew around in varying directions, erratic and random. On more than one occasion, these strange orbs collided with one another, which caused a shower of bright red sparks and what sounded like a metallic crash, only to shoot off again at breakneck speeds in opposing directions. On a number of occasions, these objects were seen to almost stop, only to hover slowly high above the tree line into the night sky, almost as if they were taking a wee peek to see what was around. The main control tower of the airbase was also picking up these strange objects. They could see them clear as day with the naked eye, yet they were giving off no form of radio signature and were not being picked up by radar. The order was given across all comms that at no point were personnel to attempt to investigate. They were to stand fast and do nothing other than observe. Around this time, 6 miles to the south at RAF Woodbridge, the guards that were stationed at the East Gate had radioed to report having observed a small aircraft of some kind slowly descend into the woods a short distance away from the airfield. Lieutenant Charles Holt was the duty officer that night. He was the man giving the orders and as such instructed a small patrol to head out to Rendlesham Forest to investigate and validate the sightings. He dispatched a 3-man team into the forest, consisting of Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burrows, and Ed Cabinsag. They later reported that the closer they got to the site, the warmer it got. All 3 men also became aware of a constant humming noise, a noise that only grew more loud and intense the closer they got. The 3 airmen were startled when they heard strange and unnatural screams and cries, which appeared to be coming from the area they were heading to. As the men looked at each other, regained their composure, and continued on with their orders, they soon realised that the screams were that of the livestock at nearby Capel Green Farm. It would appear that someone or something had frightened the animals and worked them up into an audible frenzy. Staff Sergeant Peniston made the decision that the men should split up. Why? He was clearly not a fan of horror movies. Splitting up is never a good idea. His orders were for Cabinsag to follow the tree line for a short distance to the north, in the direction of the other base RAF Bentwaters, which would leave Burrows and himself to continue further into the forest. They hadn't gone very far when they entered a small clearing in the woods. Before them, they saw a strange metallic object hovering a foot above the ground. Neither of the men could identify the origins of the craft. Even though Peniston was a qualified specialist in aircraft identification, he had never seen anything like this, whether belonging to the Soviets or American Air Forces. It was described as being shiny, metallic and a triangle shape. It was illuminated by a series of small red lights and even smaller blue ones. They could both see underneath the craft and noted a strange yellow mustard-coloured mist being emitted onto the ground below. As the 2 airmen cautiously approached the craft, it remained perfectly still and silent. Peniston noticed that there were no markings on the exterior of the object, none whatsoever, no joins, no rivets, or any signs of manufacture. There were no signs of a propulsion system or exhaust ports either, and certainly didn't seem to have any visible steering mechanism like flaps or fins. It seemed to be smooth, almost like the entire structure was one single piece. Burrows stopped in disbelief, but the staff sergeant was a wee bit more curious. Burrows watched as his senior officer approached the hovering craft. Only once he got right up close to the craft. Peniston was able to see strange markings that he would later say resembled ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. With a shaky hand, Peniston reached out and touched the ship's exterior. He described it as utterly smooth and warm to the touch. He described this moment by saying that as his hand passed over the surface and onto the engraved symbols, it felt like his hand went from sliding across a sheet of glass and onto sandpaper. He also said that he could feel a light humming sensation beneath his fingertips. Suddenly, and without warning, the staff sergeant felt a jolt, as if a small current of electricity was being passed through his body. The hieroglyph symbols began to light up to the point where the bright light was so intense that it temporarily blinded him and obscured his view. It was like someone shining a very bright torch directly into his eyes. He would later go on to say that at this time, as he was trying to regain his focus, he could see what he described as a long string of ones and zeros dancing around at the edge of his field of vision. This went on for a few minutes, when it abruptly came to an end. The two airmen remained at their position, still watching the craft. Penniston had commented that he felt no strangeness or ill effects after what had just happened. The men were able to take extensive notes and sketches of the craft, as they were actually stood in the clearing watching it for about 45 minutes. Then, in an instant, the object unexpectedly shot off, horizontally and at lightning speed, deep into the forest, moving swiftly, avoiding trees and objects as it went. The two men then hurried back to rendezvous with Cabinsag, who was waiting for them. He had also said that he had seen the object shooting through the woods, although not in the same detail as his crewmates. All three men made their way back to the East Gate, where they reported the encounter to the waiting Lieutenant Colonel Holt. Once the men had relayed to the Lieutenant Colonel exactly what had happened, he didn't scoff at them or disbelieve them. He was a stickler for protocol, so he simply formulated everything into a formal report and passed it on directly to his superiors and the local police. An investigation was underway, and more military personnel were dispatched to the clearing. It was reported that they discovered strange indentations on the ground along with burn marks. Over the next few days, Holt was both frustrated and surprised that his report had not garnered any type of response from his superiors. So when another group of airmen reported yet seeing another strange anomalous object hovering around the woods, he decided this time to venture into the forest with a small team. He wanted to see what was going on for himself. In the early hours on the 28th of December, a small party of military airmen entered the woods and headed for the clearing described by Burrows and Penniston. Armed only with flashlights and a Geiger counter, they couldn't take any other equipment such as weapons due to Rendlesham Forest being technically out of their jurisdiction. Holt had also brought along his portable tape recorder, so he could dictate any findings as the squad ventured deeper into the forest. Once they arrived at the clearing, he discovered a series of circular markings scorched into the ground. At a wider angle, it was clear that the total sum of these markings formed a large triangle shape. Further investigation of the site revealed similar burn marks on the trunks of surrounding trees, as well as several broken branches and destroyed foliage. When the airmen got closer to the marks which had scorched the earth, the Geiger counter they had equipped would click faster, sending the reading to over double that of normal background radiation levels. Holt continued to dictate the findings into the tape recorder before one of his men shouted a warning. Up above them in the sky to the east, a strange red-coloured object could be seen, an object similar to what the men had experienced before. It was descending fast, right towards the group of airmen.
0148, we're hearing very strange sounds out of the farmer's barnyard animals. It's very, very active, making an awful lot of noise.
Yes, in a pigmentation.
You just saw a light where? Wait, now slow down. Where?
Right in this position here, straight ahead, in between the tree. There it is again. Watch, straight ahead off my flashlight there, sir. There it is.
Hey, I see it too. What is it?
We don't know, sir.
So, can I get some of it? Yeah, it's a strange, small red light. Looks to be out maybe a quarter to half mile, maybe further out. I'm going to switch off it. The light is gone now. It was approximately 120 degrees from the site. Is it back again?
Yes, sir.
Oh, that's the flashlight set. Everything else is just deathly calm. There is no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead.
Yellow.
It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird. Okay, we're looking at the thing. We're probably about 200 to 300 yards away. It looks like an eye winking at you. It's still moving from side to side. And when you put the star scope on it, it sort of has a hollow stare, a dark stare. It's like the pupil of an eye looking at you and winking.
On the Lieutenant Colonel's tape recording, he describes what he was seeing as being like an eye winking down at the men below. Stopping before descending fully, the object changed direction and began to move away from them. The group was able to follow the object for a short distance before they all witnessed it breaking up into 3 smaller objects. These smaller craft began whipping around the night sky just above their heads, performing manoeuvres never before seen or even possible with anything on Earth. The objects emitted a red glow and travelled at impossible speeds. A short time later, the men opted to return back to the base. These strange orbs had now took up a formation directly over RAF Woodbridge before putting on yet another aerial display, buzzing back and forth and at high speeds across the airfield. It was witnessed that the crafts were periodically beaming a crimson light down onto the weapons lockers dotted across the base. This went on for some 3 hours before suddenly shooting off again towards the sea, passing back over RAF Bentwaters as they went. This left the American military personnel wondering what the hell had just happened. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt produced a detailed report of the events that night in Rendlesham Forest. This report was dutifully submitted to his superiors as well as British military officials. This report, however, was completely dismissed out of hand. They accused the airmen of being naive and that they simply misunderstood everything that they had witnessed. This entire ordeal, as well as the subsequent report, may well have been brushed under the carpet, as with many similar reports, but the main issue here was that this was not the first incident like this to have taken place at RAF Bentwaters. Back in 1956, radar operators based there had picked up several unknown objects rapidly approaching from over the sea. These objects were unidentified and appeared to be travelling at several thousand miles per hour. At this exact moment, a C-47 transport aircraft was making its final approach to land on the runway at RAF Bentwaters, when it had to abort the landing as a fast-moving white light suddenly shot across its path, startling the pilot. RAF Lakenheath was another similar base 60 miles to the north. They received calls from the radar team at Bentwaters and they too confirmed picking up these anomalous craft travelling at great speeds on their own radar screens. It wasn't long before they could see the objects with their own eyes. They were no longer little blips on a radar screen. They were here. The ground crews at RAF Lakenheath witnessed groups of red and green coloured objects buzzing around the skies to the south. Fighter jets were immediately scrambled to intercept and soon were up in the air where they relayed visual confirmation of the objects. Almost immediately, one of the fighter pilots had to abandon the recon mission as all of his onboard navigational instruments started to malfunction at the same time. The remaining pilots reported that they had been outpaced and outmanoeuvred by these objects, one of which had aggressively pursued one of the Venom fighter jets until he too abandoned the mission and returned to Lakenheath Air Base. Like most of these reported events, especially back in the 1980s, both British and American governments attempted to write off these events as meteor showers. So, back to the 80s now. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Air Forces for the whole of Europe was General Charles Gabriel. He was given the task of investigating the events which took place that December in Rendlesham. It took him over a fortnight to eventually arrive at Bentwaters, and it was abundantly clear that he was not there to listen to the witness accounts or to entertain any woohoo theories about little green men flying saucers. According to Gabriel and his team of investigators, the objects which had been sighted in the Suffolk skies that December were nothing more than the remnants of a Soviet rocket which had been re-entering the atmosphere. Even the accounts of the Lieutenant Colonel and his team of the incidents which took place on the 28th of December were similarly explained away. Along the coastline from the 2 RAF bases sat the Orford Lighthouse. If you remember, during Halt's account, he said that it appeared as though the light was winking at the men. This statement, and the time it takes for the lighthouse lamp to complete a full rotation, coupled with the timings of the Allied sightings recorded in Halt's tape recorder, led Gabriel's team to conclude that the lighthouse beacon was the cause for this phenomenon. But what about the clearing where the craft had landed? There was evidence that surely can't be explained away so easily. Well, they did. They reported that the strange scorch marks and indentations left behind were nothing more than animal burrows. The strange marks left on the trees? Well, they claimed that these were left by forestry workers or maybe even youths playing a prank. General Gabriel and his team's investigation obviously came under scrutiny, especially by the professionals involved that had witnessed the incidents firsthand. It's well documented that he refused to listen to any explanations that would be deemed out of this world, as well as the lack of cooperation with the British authorities and the fact that the people, airmen and staff involved were heavily intimidated and coerced by senior officials. Those that witnessed and reported these bizarre events, including Steve Longero and the sentries posted at RAF Bentwaters, were ordered to sign official secrets documentation barring them from discussing these events for a period of no less than 30 years. However, for the staff at RAF Woodbridge, the investigating team would take more drastic steps to ensure secrecy. During interviews, those involved were instructed not to discuss what they had seen with anyone else. They were expressly forbidden from doing so and told that if they went against these orders, that bullets were cheap and would be used to enforce silence. Some of the airmen had stranger experiences. One such airman was summoned to attend an interview of sorts. This was to be conducted at a property that was off base. This was, of course, strange in of itself. Why off base? It would go against so many security protocols. So as not to question authority, the individual attended the meeting anyway. When he arrived at an old farmhouse, he was met by two men that he described as looking incognito. He felt uneasy before even arriving at the meeting, but now this feeling was replaced by foreboding and fear. There was something very wrong with these two men. He claimed that they had doll-like eyes and had strange, bizarre mannerisms. After being in the presence of these two men for a little more than half an hour, the airman made some excuses and left the meeting. He was positive that these men were certainly not who they claimed to be. When he had returned to the base and spoke to his superior officers to ask for an explanation as to why that he was summoned to a meeting off base and who the hell were the two interviewers, his bosses would not only say that they had no idea of the meeting, but they also demanded to know the location of the farmhouse, as this was not a military order. A small team, along with the airman that was the subject of said interview, attended the location only 2 hours later. However, upon their arrival at the farmhouse, it was run down and dilapidated. No one had been in or around the place for years, despite the fact that only 2 hours prior, the airman was sitting in a fully decorated and well-lit farmhouse being asked dodgy questions by two strange men dressed in black. This whole encounter affected the young airman to such an extent that he had to seek therapy in the following months. The aggressive tactics, threats and psychological manipulation used by the American authorities to contain the incidents at both RAF bases were in stark contrast to the actual official reported findings. So let's assume then that the officials are right and all the events of that night were nothing more than natural phenomena with normal explanations. Then why bother going to such great lengths to cover up and suppress the testimony of the witnesses? Let's step away from aliens and spacecraft for a wee minute. What if it wasn't extraterrestrial, but it still warranted a mass cover-up? What if the actual truth would be as equally as terrifying if it got out to the public? It was a well-known speculation at the time that the reason the US military were setting up shop at RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge was not only for a tactical advantage against the Soviets, but to stockpile nuclear weapons. It even got so much so that the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had to come out and say that this was not the case. It was theorised that rather than the crafts being alien in nature, that they were in fact the Soviets themselves. Witnesses who have spoken about the case claimed that the beams of light they saw were concentrated on the weapons lockers on the bases. Could this have been some sort of advanced experimental Soviet tech that was being used? The thing with that theory is, it's been 40 years since the incident, and the world has yet to see such technology from any nation, let alone Russia. Of course, as with any such incident, theories and explanations will come out. The more time that passes, the more people want to try and get their opinions heard, some of them silly, and some of them more credible than others. One of these theories is that the whole incident was nothing more than a government experiment, and the staff and airmen involved were the unwitting participants. Some have speculated that it may have been some sort of mind control experiment that the men were unaware of. It was also alleged that the whole reason for the US military being at both air bases had nothing to do with the reasons that they gave. More recently, a local resident was in the process of upgrading his internet and was told by the cable engineer who carried out the upgrade that he had uncovered a mysterious bundle of buried cables that all led to the base. Apparently, these cables were large, thick networking cables that dated back to the early 80s, many years before such a thing had been invented. Besides the allegations that both bases were used as secret testing grounds for experimental weapons, theories have emerged about the personnel stationed there. It's been alleged that the whole incident was nothing more than pranks being played between the staff at the two bases, and that red lights were installed on the patrol vehicles in attempts to scare each other. It's also been claimed that it was all down to a British SAS team that were ordered to test the security and resolve of both RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge. Sure, any one of these claims or theories could well have been what happened. Maybe the SAS rigged smoke canisters and popped wee red lights onto parachutes and stuff like that. Maybe it was just a great big hoax carried out by servicemen driving around in illuminated patrol vehicles. Or maybe it was nothing more than hallucinations brought on by secret government experiments in mind control. But then what about Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, spending all that time so close to a flying craft that they were able to touch it, even make sketches of it? Neither of the officers had reason to lie about such outlandish things, certainly not at the risk of ridicule and potentially losing their careers. In the years since the incident, the men have retired and been diagnosed with and treated for PTSD. Penniston has come forward to say that he doesn't actually believe that the craft he interacted with that night came from outer space. He said he thought it came from someplace much closer to home. Jim Penniston described the sensation he felt when he touched the craft as some kind of information download. In later years, he would meet with UFO experts and provide copies of the sequences of ones and zeros that he had written down at the time, as they were still fresh in his memory. The staff sergeant said that at the time of the incident he didn't even know what binary code was and would only learn of that later in life. Analysis of his notes looking at the series of binary code would reveal a message. That message would claim that the craft originated in the year 8100 and that it had in fact travelled back through time as opposed to travelling through space from another galaxy. As well as this information, the code also contained coordinates for various landmarks throughout history, including the pyramids and Stonehenge. This testimony from Penniston is certainly thought-provoking and interesting. What makes it even more interesting, though, is the striking similarity of his version of events to that of an incident which took place in the US town of Kecksburg back in 1965. Witnesses there reported seeing and experiencing an almost identical craft described at Rendlesham. It was the same shape and was adorned with the same markings. Could this have been the exact same or similar craft, maybe stopping off at another time and location? Lieutenant Colonel Holt, since his retirement from the United States Air Force, has maintained his story. He spent many years investigating, discussing and conducting interviews about this incident. He has written books and been involved in numerous documentaries, all the while sticking to his original account of what actually took place. Holt in his testimony is certainly harder to discredit than that of young servicemen racked with nerves and anxiety. Holt was a veteran of both the Vietnam and Korean Wars. He had a long and experienced career in the military and was revered by his superiors as being not only experienced but also had high honour and integrity. In the years since the incident, no one has ever been able to convince him that what he witnessed that night was a result of airmen speeding around in vehicles adorned with red lights or the rotating beacon of a distant lighthouse. It's clear that the US High Command have done nothing but try their very best to discredit Lieutenant Colonel Holt's reports in this case. Are we really meant to believe that several hundred American airmen stationed across two military bases all misinterpreted and misunderstood what they were seeing? These were seasoned and highly trained soldiers that held ample experience from previous events in their respective military careers. The dismissive nature of the explanations offered by the American superior officers failed to take into account that these incidents took place across 2 different nights and at 2 different locations. There's no doubt that something other than the normal explanations offered did indeed take place and is very hard to explain in conventional means. Therefore, it would be reasonable to conclude that something certainly did pay a wee visit to the rural Suffolk forest on that chilly December morning over 40 years ago. So, what's your thoughts on this? Do you think it was an extraterrestrial? Maybe you have another theory that's not yet been put forth. As I always say, I want to thank you all so much for spending the time with me today. I appreciate every single one of you. Stay safe out there, folks. Watch out for wee green men in flying saucers. And as always, keep smiling.